So we have two speakers coming up first, Elizabeth Kneebone. And Elizabeth is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute and is the co-author of Confronting Suburban Poverty in America. So she has a really insightful presentation for us. But here's the thing, here's what you don't know. She is one hell of a trombone player. In fact, she plays trombone in her family's band. She's the youngest member of that band, so I guess all that was left was the trombone. Elizabeth? And it, yeah.
Thank you for that introduction, and I promise you there will be no trombone playing tonight. I really appreciate the invitation to be here tonight and be part of this very important conversation. So in the maybe now more than 10 years that I've been at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, we've been doing an in-depth series of research on the changing geography of poverty across the country, but particularly in our largest metropolitan areas, the 100 largest metropolitan areas. And part of that's understanding what does this trend look like in different places? How is this playing out in different types of communities? But it's also about understanding why are we seeing the shifts that we have seen, and what are the implications for people, for communities, for policymaking, and how we think about interventions to connect people to economic opportunity. And in 2013, my colleague Alan Berube and I pulled this all together into a book called Confronting Suburban Poverty in America. And part of writing this book was trying to connect the dots across all these questions we had been asking, but it also gave us an opportunity to get out of DC, to travel to regions across the country, to really understand how communities were experiencing these shifts and what people were doing at the local and regional level to really respond to these challenges. And this region in King County, particularly South King County, was one of the first places we came in trying to understand this from the local level, partly because what's happening in this region is emblematic of what we're seeing across the nation, and also because of the innovation that really has been found here in how people are coming to address these issues as a region. So my role tonight is to help situate, I think, what will be a very locally driven conversation in a national context, to share with you what we've seen across the country and hopefully provide some framing for the rest of the discussion this evening. And so if we look at what do the trends show across the nation, what's happened in our major metropolitan areas, it's not that poverty hasn't grown in cities or in rural communities or in smaller regions. It's just that in the 2000s, we saw the fastest pace of growth in poverty occurring in our suburbs. And we also passed a tipping point as a nation, where for the first time, there are now more poor residents living in the suburbs of our major metropolitan areas than in the cities, the large cities that anchor them. About more than 3 million more poor by 2015 were living in suburbs than in cities in our major metro areas, and 3 million more poor in the suburbs, and 8 million more poor than we've seen in rural America, the places where we typically tend to think of poverty residing in the country. And one of the things that has been so striking about this trend is that it has not been isolated to a few regions. It's not just certain parts of the country that are driving this rapid uptick that we've seen, especially in the 2000s. It's been a very broadly shared trend across almost every major metro area. This is including places in older industrial parts of the country like Detroit or Cleveland or Chicago, places we tend to think of as being home to high rates of urban poverty. All of those regions saw above average growth in their suburban poor populations and now count more poor people outside their central cities than in them. And they're also joined, though, by other parts of the country, the boom and bust Sunbelt places like that both benefited from the housing boom but were on the front lines of the foreclosure crisis, like Las Vegas, Nevada, Atlanta, and Georgia, where we saw the poor population in the suburbs more than double in just over the span of a decade. But we also see this trend taking place in stronger markets like the Seattle region, like the Bay Area, Portland, Washington, D.C., who've all also shared in this trend and seen poverty growing outside their urban core. Now, most major metro areas are part of this picture where they have more poor people in their suburbs than in their central cities. And another striking dynamic about this trend is that we're not just talking about places right over the city line, right over that city border into the inner ring suburbs that often look very urbanized and much like the central city themselves. Yes, those places have seen poverty grow in recent years, but we've also seen poverty growth extend beyond those places as well. into outerlying communities, exurban neighborhoods, middle-class bastions we often think of as being immune to these trends. This really has seen this broadening reach throughout our regions in terms of where poverty is and who it's affecting. Yet, as Executive Constantine mentioned, even as poverty has regionalized and spread in its footprint, it hasn't done so evenly. We've seen concentrated poverty also grow rapidly, particularly in the post-recession period, where now it's not just growing in our urban neighborhoods where we've often long associated that those concentrations, those very pockets of high poverty, where you face not just the burden of being poor, but being poor in a very poor place that can create so many barriers to actually connecting to the types of opportunities that provide a path out of poverty. Now, the fastest pace of growth in both the incidence of high poverty neighborhoods and the populations living in high poverty neighborhoods has actually happened outside our urban core in recent years. Once again, the suburbs lead the country in terms of these growing pockets of poverty. Now, about 41% of poor people in the suburbs live in a neighborhood that has a poverty rate of 20% or higher, and those rates are even higher than that when you look at poor people of color in the suburbs. Now, more than half of Black and Hispanic residents in the suburbs who are poor live in high poverty neighborhoods and are facing that double burden of being poor in a poor place. So why is this happening? What has been driving this shift, this very broadly shared growth in suburban poverty? As we've unpacked this over the years, we see there are a number of factors that generally are working together to help drive up these numbers and explain this expanded reach of poverty. And I'll walk through some of these right now. One that we often think of is more poor people are moving to the suburbs. And part of that is sort of emblematic of broader trends, notwithstanding the sort of renewed growth in cities in recent years. In the 2000s, suburbs actually added population at a faster pace than cities overall. We are a suburban nation. Most people live in the suburbs in America. And as those suburbs continued to grow, they became more diverse, both economically and demographically. And part of that reflects shifting immigration patterns. Research has shown that increasingly, as immigrants come into metropolitan regions, they're bypassing central cities and moving directly to the suburbs. Now, some of that also reflects, particularly in this region, the refugee resettlement population, as we look at where foreign-born residents are moving. But while we've seen that the foreign-born population has helped drive suburban population growth, it's accounted for almost a third of growth in suburban population over the 2000s, it's a smaller share of the growth in the poor population nationally. It's about 17%. Now, that gets higher in certain regions like this one, but by and large, this has been a native-born driven phenomenon. And part of the shifting patterns more generally, whether native-born or foreign-born, and who's moving to the suburbs, reflects the housing market in regions. Where is affordable housing located? In some places across the country, like this region, you've seen renewed development in the city, increasing housing price pressures, causing people to look further out for affordable options. The drive till you qualify, drive till you can find affordable rent in the suburbs. In some cases, at the same time, what you've seen is suburban communities built maybe in the post-war period with aging housing stock that may be becoming affordable over time, actually opening up options for families to move to suburban communities. We've also seen the role of housing choice vouchers help explain some of this trend. Those subsidies are supposed to be portable and offering residents and families choice in where they live. And we've seen a shift of voucher households towards the suburbs over the 2000s. In our major metro areas now, about half of voucher households live in the suburbs. And of course, if we're thinking about the housing market and these recent trends, we know that the foreclosure crisis had an outsized impact on the suburbs as well in recent years. In that boom, the sort of subprime lending boom in the mid-2000s, about 3/4 of subprime loans that took place in the 100 largest metro areas were located in suburban communities. And then when the foreclosure crisis hit and the bottom dropped out, about 3/4 of foreclosures also took place in suburbs. So that also helped to sort of shift the map of affordability in the regional housing market in a number of places. But it's not just housing that dictates where people may want to live or where they're needing to move. It's also about where jobs are located. We've seen in almost every major metro area, jobs continue to shift away from downtown. Even if downtowns are adding jobs, often suburbs are adding jobs at a faster pace. And when we look at the types of jobs like retail, service sector, construction, manufacturing, those tend to be even more suburbanized on average. So those are jobs that can pay lower wages, but also ones that were hit hard by the Great Recession and the fallout of the downturn. And that takes us to sort of another set of levers, not just about people moving to the suburbs, because this trend is actually bigger than just the in-migrants to these communities. It's also about the downward mobility of a lot of longtime suburban residents. So we see the impact of the regional economy on these trends. Yes, we had 2 recessions in the last decade, including the Great Recession, which, because of its housing-led nature, hit suburbs more so than in past downturns. We saw unemployment rates rise by nearly equal degrees in cities and suburbs over the course of the downturn. But it's not just the cyclical blips or downturns that help explain these trends, because we've also seen structural changes in the economy that led to the decline of the typical household income even before the recession hit. So the growth of low-wage jobs, the erosion of middle-class employment, and many of those jobs are in the suburbs, which suggests that this is a long-term sort of new normal, that suburbs are now going to be struggling with poverty alongside cities even as we move further into economic recovery. So why does this matter? Is it a good thing or a bad thing that we see more poverty in the suburbs? Well, if you have more people with access to better jobs and schools and healthy communities, that can be an excellent sort of toehold for people trying to work their way up the economic ladder. The challenge is that poverty is growing faster and often in communities that are not well equipped and don't necessarily offer access to those sorts of opportunities. So it creates new challenges for the poor who are finding themselves in the suburban context. For one, as we've already heard about earlier this evening, suburbs often tend to lack access to things like public transit. If it is available to low-income suburban communities, the service tends to be less frequent, the connectivity is weaker than what you might find in an urban center. And basically the result being the share of jobs that are reachable in a typical commute for a suburban worker is much smaller than for an urban counterpart. And knowing that jobs are moving to the suburbs and we're seeing a growth of poverty in the suburbs, what we've actually seen as the net effect of that is that people have gotten further away from employment opportunities over time. So that creates a sort of spatial mismatch challenge in terms of connecting people to economic opportunity. The safety net also tends to be much thinner and much patchier in suburban communities that haven't spent decades sort of building up the same sorts of services that cities often have been developed to offer. That can make it much harder as they see this growing need, and often the budgets haven't kept up to make sure that families and residents in these communities are able to connect to really important wraparound support services that can help them weather downturns in the economy or find connections to economic opportunity. Part of that, the thinness of the safety net in the suburbs, is because philanthropic resources have lagged behind in many cases. Research by colleagues of ours, Margaret Weir and Sarah Reckow, have found that philanthropic funding for low-income services disproportionately still tends to end up in cities, even in regions where now more poor people live in the suburbs. And part of this is just a capacity issue, a sort of chicken and egg challenge, that if you don't have a strong service provider in the suburbs, it's hard to direct philanthropic resources there. Yet, what this research also found is that very few resources are being spent to build capacity in the suburbs. So then how do you begin to break that cycle and overcome some of the gaps that we're now seeing? When you ask the same question about government services, that's a very tricky question to answer and untangle. Some work I'm doing right now, actually in trying to map federal investments, though, tells a similar story. It's suggesting a similar story as what we're seeing with philanthropic funding, that it has tended to lag behind and still is disproportionately in urban centers, even as need has moved beyond those places. And part of that is because of the similar challenge, this lack of capacity, not just in the nonprofit safety net, but suburbs themselves may not have the staff capacity to apply for funding, to be able to step up to the additional needs and challenges that these places, again, often weren't built to address. Part of that's complicated by the fact that when you're talking about the suburbs, you're not talking about one place. It's a tapestry of many different communities, often very small places that just don't have the wherewithal to grapple with something that's operating at a much larger scale than they are. And then, of course, you have inflexible and unreliable funding. So why is some of this federal funding not keeping up? It's because it was designed with a very different geography of poverty in mind. And it has actually proven pretty inflexible and difficult to adapt to this broader regional footprint. When we were writing the book, we sort of came up with a back-of-the-envelope calculation about what do we spend, what does the federal government spend on programs to address poverty in place? $82 billion So it's just a significant investment. But when you look at it, it's spread across 81 different programs, 10 different agencies. And most of these programs were built with distressed inner city neighborhoods in mind, which are places that are still in need of help, but also means these programs don't necessarily map easily onto the suburban context, where you may be talking about multiple communities and broader distances of places that are grappling with these challenges. The silver lining of all of this, though, understanding this very complicated and challenging landscape, when we began researching the book and traveling to different places, we found local and regional leaders were finding innovative ways to grapple with the broader reach of poverty, even and maybe because the federal government hadn't really led the way in doing so. And what we realized that in each of these different regions that we visited and models that we were surfacing and seeing is that there was generally a quarterback in the region, what we call a quarterback, someone who could help navigate this very complex tapestry, weave together multiple funding sources to try and help resources stretch further to help more people in more places. And in doing so, while these models that we saw were often very diverse and had grew up to adapt and address a wide array of regional challenges and opportunities, there were common themes. There were common denominators that we think provide some principles that can help point a way to a more effective way of grappling with poverty across urban and suburban communities alike. Many of these, I think we heard already, sort of elevated in Executive Constantine's remarks. One, they're figuring out a way to achieve a more effective scale, getting to a better geographic footprint or scope of services to attack very complicated and now farther-reaching problems. They're figuring out ways to collaborate and integrate, cutting across jurisdictional boundaries and policy silos to link up more strategic approaches to addressing these issues. And finally, they're figuring out ways how to fund strategically. Again, that sort of funnel, that way of braiding multiple resources together, figuring out how to make limited resources work more effectively, often by using data to help drive better decision-making. So just to give you a few examples of ways we've seen this playing out in different regions across the country. One is the Denver Regional Transit-Oriented Development Fund. This is an example, again, a region that was really investing in its transit build-out. A number of partners there saw this as an opportunity to make sure that build-out had an equitable component, could actually be used to advance equity goals and connect people to more opportunity. So we had public, private, and quasi-public institutions coming together to create a flexible pool of funding so they could look at where are the planned transit lines going to go and how can we buy up land while it's still affordable and think about how to develop it with affordable housing in mind, with an eye towards how do we aggregate community resources and better connect people to sorts of housing, transit, and community development opportunities. Another example here is, again, kind of thinking about how do we overcome some of this fragmentation and lack of capacity issues, comes from the Chicago region, where in the wake of the foreclosure crisis, a number of small suburban jurisdictions were really struggling and recognizing that they were working on shared issues, but none of them had the capacity to address them at the scale at which they were experiencing them. So you had 25 different, originally it was 19, as it has expanded to 25 different South suburban municipalities who were able to come together and plan as a sub-region about how they were going to tackle their housing crisis. In doing so, they were able to attract some seed funding from a local investor, a local community foundation, who gave them that money to be able to actually hire a quarterback, somebody who could help them navigate the complex application process at the federal level. In doing so, in the years that they've been working together, they've been able to attract more than $30 million, a 50-to-1 return on that initial philanthropic investment, to tackle things like housing, dealing with housing blight, affordable housing preservation and redevelopment. And they've also used those tools to actually seed and start up things like a local land bank, a TOD fund of their own, and figuring out ways to use data and transparent data decision-making processes so each community can understand how they're spending their shared resources. Finally, I'll give you one more example here from the DC region. Montgomery County is often thought of as a very wealthy county, but it's also where poverty has been growing fastest, and one of the not fastest, but among one of the fastest communities where poverty has been growing in the DC region. It's also a very diverse place. It's now a majority-minority community with a very large foreign-born population, and the county saw that they were missing people, that they were people, especially in the wake of the recession, who needed services but weren't connecting. And so what they did was look at where are the highest need communities, where are the hardest hit places, using a lot of data to help them direct and target their interventions. And then they collaborated with grassroots organizations and trusted nonprofits to figure out, could they find a partner near transit, somebody who was transit accessible, where they could actually co-locate and integrate county and nonprofit services. And it wasn't a county building, because they wanted to make sure that there was a trusted partner for communities to be able to reach. And in doing so, they were able to increase their reach and make sure they were now serving more people who were not being served before, and to build community in these places through actually trying to create networks and opportunities for these newly churning and transforming communities to get together and know each other and use each other as a resource as well. So again, these are just a few examples. All of them experienced their bumps along the way in trying something new and standing up something innovative, but they really do help, I think, point the way towards the types of initiatives, the types of principles that can move us towards a more scaled, a more integrated and collaborative approach to using our limited resources more effectively as we think about how to increase access to opportunity in cities and suburbs alike. I hope that these can help inform some of the conversation we're having here tonight. If you want to learn more about any of these examples, you can visit confrontingsuburbanpoverty.org and see a number of other case studies as well, including ones from this region right here. And again, I really look forward to an engaging conversation, and thank you so much for having me.